You know that moment, when the day is technically over. Your body is tired, the room is quiet, and yet your mind suddenly decides this is the perfect time to reopen every unfinished conversation, every awkward memory, every decision you still haven't made, every possible future that could go wrong. You lie there trying to rest, but instead your mind starts building case files. It reviews a text you sent 6 hours ago. It replays the way someone looked at you in a meeting. It imagines what you should have said last week. Then it jumps ahead to next month, next year, the version of your life that could collapse if you make one wrong move. And somehow, even when nothing is happening around you, it feels like too much is happening inside you. Or maybe it happens during the day. You need to send an email, make a choice, answer a message, post something, start a project, end a relationship, commit to a plan, and what should be a simple action turns into an invisible courtroom inside your head. One part of you argues for caution, another argues for urgency, another starts predicting humiliation, regret, failure, misunderstanding. By the time you finally do something, if you do anything at all, you're already exhausted. And this is what makes overthinking so confusing. From the inside, it doesn't feel irrational. It feels responsible. It feels like you are trying to be careful, trying to understand, trying not to make mistakes, trying to see the whole picture. It even feels at times like a kind of intelligence, as if your suffering is evidence that you are taking life seriously. But then the hours pass. The problem remains. Your energy drops. Your clarity gets worse. And you start wondering whether your mind is helping you at all. A lot of people quietly carry this shame. They think, why can't I just let things go? Why does everything become complicated in my head? Why can other people move on while I keep circling the same thing? Maybe I'm too anxious. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe I'm just weak. Maybe I don't trust myself. Maybe something is wrong with me. But what if the real story is more interesting than that? What if overthinking is not a sign that you care too much, or that you are broken, or even that you are especially deep? What if, very often, overthinking is what happens when the mind confuses mental activity with progress? That shift matters, because once you see that, you stop treating overthinking like wisdom, and you start seeing it for what it often is, a system stuck in the wrong mode, trying to create certainty where certainty may not exist. One of the most useful ways to understand this comes from Daniel Kahneman's idea that the mind operates in two very different styles. One is fast, automatic, intuitive. It reacts before you explain anything to yourself. It reads tone, danger, familiarity, threat, social signals. The other is slower, more deliberate, more analytical. This is the part that reasons, compares, evaluates, justifies, plans. Most people hear this and assume the slow mind is the wise one, the mature one, the reliable one. If fast thinking is impulsive, then slow thinking must be the cure. So when you feel uncertain, you think more. When you feel anxious, you analyze more. When you feel stuck, you push harder with logic. It seems reasonable. But here's the trap. The slower part of the mind is not a machine for truth. It is also vulnerable. It can be recruited by fear. It can be hijacked by bias. It can become the lawyer of an anxious intuition rather than the judge of it. In other words, you often don't overthink because you are discovering new truth. You overthink because an earlier, faster part of your mind has already sounded an alarm. And now your slower mind is working overtime trying to explain the alarm, control the alarm, justify the alarm, or solve a problem that may not even be shaped correctly yet. That is why overthinking can feel so intense without becoming so useful. The engine is running, the dashboard is lit up, there is effort, motion, heat, but there is no real movement. It is like pressing hard on the gas while the car is still in neutral. The noise makes it feel like something important is happening, but you are not actually getting anywhere. This is one reason people who think a lot are not always people who see clearly. Thinking longer is not the same as thinking better. A mind can stay busy for hours using the same flawed assumptions, the same fears, the same distorted predictions, and simply produce more elegant versions of the same confusion. You can see this in ordinary life. You send a message and don't get a reply. Your fast mind reacts first. Something is wrong. Maybe they're upset. Maybe I said too much. Maybe I shouldn't have sent that. That reaction happens almost instantly. Then the slower mind arrives, not necessarily to correct the fear, but often to serve it. It starts building theories. It scans the recent past for evidence. It replays your wording. It imagines future consequences. It turns one moment of uncertainty into a whole internal documentary. And if you don't notice what is happening, you mistake this process for insight. You tell yourself you are trying to understand. But many times, you are just feeding an alarm system with better vocabulary. This is where Kross becomes especially useful. He studies the voice in your head, that constant inner narrator that can guide you when it works well and trap you when it doesn't. His point is not that the inner voice is bad. In fact, it's one of the great tools of being human. It helps you plan, reflect, learn, rehearse, remember, make meaning. The problem begins when that voice stops being a tool and becomes an enclosure. He uses the idea of chatter to describe what happens when your inner voice gets stuck in repetitive loops, not reflection, not thoughtful processing, chatter. The same concerns, the same fears, the same scripts, hitting the walls of the mind again and again until they start sounding bigger than they are. And that distinction explains something most people feel but rarely name. Overthinking often feels productive from the inside because it mimics problem solving. There is language, there is analysis, there are scenarios, there is attention, but the process has no exit, no fresh perspective, no structural shift. You are not moving through the thought. You are orbiting it. That is why you can spend an entire evening thinking about a problem and wake up the next morning with the exact same emotional knot. The mind was active, but it was closed. It kept talking, but it had nothing new to say. This is one of the strangest things about overthinking. It can make you feel both hyper-engaged and deeply powerless at the same time. You are so mentally involved, yet increasingly unable to act. So alert, yet less clear. So full of language, yet farther from understanding. And then there is another layer, one that Jonathan Haidt helps reveal. Sometimes the problem is not just what your mind is doing, it is the environment your mind is doing it in. Because modern life gives overthinking endless raw material. You are not just alone with your thoughts anymore. You are alone with your thoughts after a day of fragmented attention, constant comparison, ambient notification, social exposure, and a subtle but exhausting sense of being watched. You see other people's lives in polished fragments. You are reminded of what you haven't done, where you haven't been, what you haven't achieved, how you could be judged, how you might be perceived. Your attention never fully lands, so your thoughts never fully settle. You don't get enough distance from stimulation to hear yourself clearly. A mind that lives too long in the social mirror cannot rest. And this matters because many people interpret their overthinking as a private defect, when part of it is actually ecological. You may not simply have a mind that thinks too much. You may have a mind that is continuously provoked into vigilance, continuously activated, continuously given new reasons to monitor itself. That doesn't remove your responsibility, but it does remove some of the unnecessary shame, because it means the question is not only, why am I like this? Sometimes the better question is, what kind of psychological climate am I living inside? Once you put these three ideas together, a clearer picture starts to appear. Your mind has fast reactions that generate alarms, impressions, and fears before you fully understand them. Your slower mind often steps in not to bring wisdom, but to create a sense of control over uncertainty. Then your inner voice can get trapped in chatter, repeating concerns without perspective or resolution, and all of this can be intensified by an environment that keeps you socially alert, mentally fragmented, and chronically stimulated. So overthinking is rarely just one thing. It is not just intelligence, it is not just anxiety, it is not just personality. It is a pattern created by the interaction between threat detection, the need for certainty, repetitive self-talk, and an environment that gives the mind too many mirrors and too little silence. This is why overthinking shows up everywhere. It shows up in relationships where you don't just feel something, you investigate it until it becomes heavier than the original moment. A delayed reply becomes a possible rejection. A slightly different tone becomes a shift in affection. A conversation from 2 days ago becomes evidence for 3 possible futures, none of them peaceful. It shows up in work, where one task becomes 20 mental branches. You don't just need to start the project, you start imagining the quality of the result, what people will think of it, whether it matches your potential, whether it will create more expectations, whether this is the right direction for your life. And then, because the task now carries the weight of identity, you freeze. It shows up in decision-making, where what should be a choice becomes a referendum on your worth. Not just should I move, but what if I choose wrong and ruin the version of my life I was supposed to become? Not just should I speak up, but what if people see I'm not as confident as I look? Not just should I rest, but what if I'm wasting time and falling behind? The thought is never just the thought. It attaches itself to a larger fear. And because the mind is skilled at building convincing narratives, you can live inside those fears as if they are foresight. You tell yourself you are being realistic, prepared, responsible. But often what you are actually experiencing is the slow construction of a story that began with discomfort and ended dressed up as truth. So what do you do with that? The first useful shift is surprisingly simple. Stop asking, how do I think this through perfectly? And start asking, what mode is my mind in right now? That question changes everything because it moves you from content to process. Instead of automatically believing the thought, you start noticing the machinery producing it. Are you in rapid threat detection, where your mind is reacting to ambiguity as if it were danger? Are you in analytical overdrive, where your slower mind is trying to manufacture certainty? Are you in chatter, where the same issue is being replayed without resolution? Or are you in environmental overstimulation, where your mind is too activated to process anything cleanly? When you ask what mode you're in, you interrupt fusion with the thought. You stop being only the person inside the storm and become even briefly the person noticing the weather. That leads to a second tool, one of the most powerful ideas from Kross. When your inner voice becomes a trap, create distance in the way you speak to yourself. Not false positivity, not forced calm, distance. Instead of saying, why am I like this? Why can't I stop? What if I mess everything up? Try speaking to yourself the way you would speak to someone you care about. Even more useful, speak to yourself almost as if you are another person. What is happening here? What is this situation actually asking of you? What would help you see this more clearly? What part of this is real, and what part is your mind trying to control? It sounds small, but it matters. Because overthinking thrives on total identification. It wants you inside the thought, wearing it like skin. Distanced self-talk loosens that grip. It reminds your nervous system that the voice in your head is not the whole of you. It is a function, a process, a perspective, not a prison. A third tool is to reduce the amount of raw material your mind can use against you. This is where the environmental side becomes practical. If your mind is already prone to looping, constant exposure to stimulation, comparison, and interruption acts like fuel on a fire. That means sometimes the healthiest response is not another insight, but less input. Less scrolling when you're already fragile, less checking for signs, less reopening the message, less bouncing between 6 tabs and 3 apps and unfinished thoughts, more single-channel attention, more physical movement, more contact with the non-digital world, more moments where the mind is allowed to land on something real enough to stop feeding on itself. You do not always need a better thought. Sometimes you need a different context. And there is one more shift that matters, because it goes directly against the hidden moral story many people attach to overthinking. You need to stop confusing uncertainty with emergency. For many overthinkers, uncertainty feels intolerable. The unanswered question feels like a threat. The unresolved emotion feels like danger. The incomplete plan feels like negligence. So the mind keeps working, not because the problem requires it, but because uncertainty itself has started to feel unsafe. But life is full of things that cannot be solved in the mind before they are lived. Some conversations only become clear once you have them. Some choices only reveal themselves after you make them. Some fears shrink only after action, not after analysis. A lot of overthinking is an attempt to reach emotional permission before movement. You want to feel fully sure, fully calm, fully informed, fully settled. But many important parts of life do not offer that luxury. Sometimes clarity is not the prerequisite for action. Sometimes action is the price of clarity. That does not mean being reckless. It means recognizing that the mind often asks for a level of certainty that reality never promised. So the real skill is not learning how to think forever. It is learning when thinking has crossed the line into self-containment. You know you are near that line when your thoughts stop creating decisions and start replacing them. When your analysis gives you the sensation of control without the reality of movement, when you feel mentally full but existentially unchanged, and once you see that pattern, something important starts to soften. You stop admiring your own mental suffering as proof of depth. You stop treating every internal alarm like a revelation. You stop assuming the longest thought is the wisest one. You begin to understand that your mind has speeds, but neither speed guarantees wisdom on its own. Fast intuition can mislead you. Slow analysis can imprison you. Inner speech can guide you. Inner speech can also become an echo chamber. The environment can support you. The environment can also keep your attention too fractured to settle into truth. This is why the old identity story starts to fall apart. Maybe you are not someone who can't let things go in some moral, permanent sense. Maybe you are someone with a mind that learned to equate mental effort with safety. Maybe you are someone whose inner voice lost perspective and started looping. Maybe you are someone living in a world that monetizes your attention, provokes your comparison, and keeps your nervous system lightly inflamed. Maybe the problem is not that you think too deeply. Maybe the problem is that your mind keeps trying to solve discomfort with the one tool it knows best, even after that tool has stopped working. That is a very different story, because it means overthinking is not your identity. It is a strategy, and strategies can be understood. They can be interrupted, they can be replaced. The next time you catch your mind reopening the same file again and again, try not to immediately ask, how do I finish this thought? Ask, what is this thought trying to do for me? Is it trying to protect you from embarrassment, from regret, from uncertainty, from loss of control, from being seen inaccurately? When you see the function, the thought becomes less mystical. It stops looking like truth and starts looking like protection. Often clumsy protection, expensive protection, exhausting protection, but protection all the same. And when you understand that, compassion becomes more precise. Not soft denial, not indulgence, precision. You are not weak because your mind reacts. You are not foolish because your mind wants certainty. You are not broken because your inner voice sometimes turns against you. You are not failing because your attention has been shaped by a world that profits from keeping you activated. You are a human being with a mind that is trying, sometimes badly, to keep you safe. That does not mean you should obey it every time, but it does mean you can stop hating yourself for having one. And maybe that is the deepest shift here. The goal is not to become a person who never thinks hard, never reflects, never anticipates, never feels the pull of mental loops. The goal is to become someone who knows the difference between insight and recursion, between reflection and rumination, between seeing clearly and staring endlessly. A wise mind is not an always busy mind. A wise mind knows when to slow down, when to step back, when to stop feeding the loop, when to leave the room of thought and return to the world itself, because some answers only appear when the mind stops interrogating life and starts re-entering it. And if this pattern lives strongly in you, it does not mean your mind is your enemy. It may simply mean you have reached the point where the old way of trying to create safety no longer works. Which is painful, yes, but it is also the beginning of something better. Because the moment you see overthinking not as your personality, but as a pattern, you gain a small but powerful freedom. You can notice it sooner, interrupt it faster, refuse to worship it, build environments that calm it. Speak to yourself with more distance. Act before certainty arrives. Let some questions stay open without treating them as threats. And over time, your mind learns something new. It learns that not every ambiguity is danger. Not every feeling requires a trial. Not every possibility deserves a forecast. Not every thought deserves a chair at the table. That is how peace returns. Not all at once. Not because the mind goes silent forever, but because you stop giving every internal alarm the status of command. You begin to trust that a life cannot be fully solved in advance. And that is not a failure of the mind. That is the condition of being alive. There are more patterns like this, hiding in the way you relate to yourself. More places where what feels like a flaw is actually a misread survival strategy. More parts of your inner life that make a different kind of sense once you see the mechanism underneath them. And sometimes that is all it takes to breathe differently inside your own head.